The goodbye was supposed to be private. No cameras, no statements, no headlines. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. Just a son, standing alone at the edge of a legacy that had finally bled out. But here's the question no one was ready to ask. How does a family so powerful, so protected, so admired, end like this? Because this wasn't just a tragedy. It was a collapse. And the warning signs were there long before the blood was found. Hollywood loves fairy tales, dynasties, last names that open doors before anyone even knocks. For decades, the Reiner name meant influence, respect, and an almost mythic level of insulation from consequence. This was a family that moved through rooms others never even saw. Private dinners, quiet favors, problems that disappeared before they became public. Until they didn't. On a quiet Sunday afternoon, behind iron gates and manicured hedges, the illusion shattered. Not with a scream heard by neighbors, not with flashing lights caught by paparazzi lenses, but with a discovery so violent, so final, it rewrote everything people thought they knew. 2 bodies, multiple wounds, no signs of forced entry, and a family suddenly split into survivors and suspects. Ask yourself this. How does a crime scene exist inside a fortress? That's the first contradiction. One of many. The estate itself was designed to keep the world out. Security cameras, long driveways, staff trained to see everything and say nothing. Yet whatever happened inside those walls unfolded without interruption. No alarm, no warning, no intervention. Which leads to the second question no one wanted to say out loud. Did someone inside know this was coming? In the hours that followed, the story began to leak, but only in fragments. Law enforcement spoke carefully. The media spoke recklessly. And online, speculation filled the silence faster than facts ever could. A son in the guest house. Another son overseas. A family friend who stopped answering calls. And a name, Jake, that kept appearing in whispers, then rumors, then outright accusations. But here's where the narrative gets dangerous. Because when tragedy strikes the powerful, the public doesn't just want answers. They want someone to blame. And sometimes, blame moves faster than truth. Jake Reiner had always been the quiet one. Not the heir apparent. Not the rebel headline maker either. He existed in the margins of a famous family, present, but rarely seen. The kind of person people overlook until the moment they can't stop staring. Was he grieving? Was he hiding? Or was he something else entirely? Depending on who you asked, the answer changed. Friends described him as distant in the weeks before the incident. Family insiders claimed there had been tension, arguments that never made it into public view. And then there were the text messages. Messages that would later be described as misinterpreted, taken out of context, and by some, deeply alarming. Which version was real? That question sat at the center of everything. Because as investigators worked the scene, another truth began to surface. This wasn't random. The wounds told a story. The placement, the force, the hesitation marks. This was personal, emotional, messy in a way no outsider could fake. So if not a stranger, then who? Hollywood history is littered with families that imploded quietly. Addiction covered up, affairs buried, financial crimes settled behind closed doors. But violence? Violence changes the rules. It drags everything into the light. And suddenly, the Reiner family was no longer a symbol of creative power, it was a case file. What made this story different wasn't just the brutality. It was the silence that followed. No immediate press conference. No family spokesperson. No emotional statement pleading for privacy. Just lawyers. And time. That silence became its own kind of evidence. People began reading meaning into what wasn't said. Online detectives reconstructed timelines with chilling confidence. And one narrative, fair or not, began to harden. That Jake knew more than he was saying. But here's the twist most people missed. There was another arrest that night. Not for murder. Not even for violence. For being there. For knowing. For not stopping what couldn't be stopped. Or maybe what was already over by the time anyone realized it had begun. That's when the phrase accomplice entered the conversation. And once that word appears, everything changes. Because now this isn't about who pulled a weapon. It's about who stayed silent. Who looked away. Who chose family over morality. Or survival over truth. And that raises the most uncomfortable question of all. If you believe something terrible is about to happen, how long do you wait before it becomes your fault too? This story matters now because it exposes a fear most people never admit. That proximity to power doesn't protect you. It traps you. That loyalty can become a weapon. And that sometimes the most devastating crimes aren't committed by monsters, but by people who hesitate at the wrong moment. Jake's goodbye wasn't spoken aloud. It wasn't written in a letter. It came later. Through legal language, courtroom procedures, and a sentence that would echo far beyond prison walls. But before we get there, you need to understand what happened before the bodies were found. The arguments that never cooled, the warning signs that were ignored, and the moment when one decision quietly locked in a fate no apology could undo. Because what came next didn't just change a family. It exposed a truth Hollywood never wanted examined. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. The walls of the Brentwood estate didn't just separate the Reiners from the world. They held stories, whispered secrets, and tensions that no gardener or security guard could erase. In those rooms, laughter often masked anger. Celebrations often hid resentments. And behind every polite greeting, there were calculations, alliances, and rivalries that outsiders would never notice. Jake had grown up surrounded by this. He saw the sparkle of fame, the sheen of privilege, and the weight of expectation. He also saw the undercurrents, small betrayals, hushed arguments, subtle manipulations that shaped the family's world. Many might have considered him the passive one, quiet, unassuming, a child in the background. But inside, he understood the stakes better than anyone. Weeks before the fateful Sunday, there were signs, minor incidents that could have been overlooked. A slammed door. A terse conversation that left someone staring after another person had walked away. Small financial disagreements. Disputes over property. The kinds of fights that, to outsiders, look like nothing, but to those living in the house, carry weight. On that Sunday, the tension reached a tipping point. The air inside the guest house felt heavy. Jake's presence alone was enough to make the normally calm domestic spaces feel charged, unpredictable. Family dynamics that had been simmering quietly suddenly had a catalyst. Nick, the other son, had always been a different kind of presence. Where Jake was quiet, contemplative, and calculating, Nick was impulsive, expressive, and often prone to outbursts. Their personalities clashed over years, sometimes in public, but often in private, leaving the household tense with unspoken conflicts. Who knew, in those hours leading up to the tragedy, how old grievances could transform into catastrophic decisions? Neighbors recalled that morning as eerily normal. The sun glinted off perfectly trimmed hedges. Birds chirped in the surrounding trees. Life moved at its usual pace outside the gates. But inside, the atmosphere was suffocating. No one could see the emotional storms brewing, the accumulation of resentment, fear, and frustration. It's a stark reminder. Appearances in a life of privilege are often the most dangerous illusion. The investigation revealed that the attack was not random or chaotic. It had intent, precision, and a grim sense of timing. It raised chilling questions. How much planning had gone into this? How many private conversations, how many suppressed warnings had gone unheeded? And if someone inside knew what was coming, what prevented them from acting? Law enforcement found evidence that suggested preparation. The positioning of objects, the movement patterns, the sequence of events, all pointed toward a narrative far more complex than a simple crime of passion. Jake's proximity to the unfolding events placed him in a gray zone of complicity. Not the one wielding violence, but the one who was there, the one who could have intervened. And that is the tension at the heart of this story, presence versus action. What responsibility do we carry when we witness a calamity? When do we become participants simply by being present? Jake's role forced observers, both investigators and the public, to confront uncomfortable realities about morality, family, and loyalty. As news broke, social media erupted with speculation. Headlines flashed words like betrayal, accomplice, and family tragedy. Analysts debated whether this was a crime of passion, premeditation, or something even more insidious. Fans of the family's work and cultural presence were forced to reconcile the iconography they loved with the darkness revealed behind closed doors. Psychologists were called in to analyze behavior. Legal experts dissected potential charges. Everyone wanted to understand the human element, the why, not just the what. Because the story wasn't merely about the act itself. It was about the decisions, hesitations, and missed interventions that made the act possible. By the end of that first night, the public narrative began forming. But it was only a surface version, missing the nuances and private dramas that had built up over decades. Inside the walls of the estate, the echoes of past arguments, long-standing rivalries, and unspoken fears had culminated in irreversible events. And yet, despite the tragedy, a larger story loomed. One that questioned not just the actions of those involved, but the very structure of a family built on power and reputation. Could a family survive once trust is shattered in such a fundamental way? What happens to the surviving members, the witnesses, the silent participants, and the world that once admired them? Jake's goodbye wasn't just a legal statement or a procedural acknowledgement. It was a symbolic moment, a recognition of consequences, guilt, and the weight of a family legacy now forever altered. And it set the stage for the unfolding narrative, which would expose more secrets, reveal hidden alliances, and ultimately challenge our assumptions about loyalty, morality, and justice. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. It starts with a name. Names carry weight, and in Hollywood, some names are almost sacred. The Reiner family name, once synonymous with creative genius, prestige, and carefully curated public images, was one of them. To the world, they were storytellers, visionaries, larger-than-life figures whose influence spanned generations. To each other, they were human, flawed, and fragile in ways no headline could capture. Jake Reiner grew up in this world of dualities. On the surface, the family epitomized success, award-winning careers, sprawling estates, invitations to exclusive events, and connections that opened doors globally. Yet beneath the glittering veneer, the family was a crucible of competing egos, unspoken resentments, and a relentless pressure to maintain appearances. What kind of childhood is it when your father is a legend and your every move is scrutinized by friends, by strangers, even by the people who should love you the most? Jake's upbringing was defined by that question. Small victories were often minimized. Mistakes were magnified. Love was conditional, tied to performance, decorum, and an unspoken metric of success. Nick, the elder son, was everything Jake was not: impulsive, outspoken, and prone to acting before thinking. Their differences fueled both admiration and friction. Nick's life was a series of grand gestures and public adventures. Jake's path was quieter, less noticeable, but no less intense. He learned early that silence could be both shield and prison. The family dynamics weren't simple. Their mother, Michelle, was the heart of the household, protective, disciplined, but also prone to tension with the children. Arguments in the Reiner home were often undercurrents, subtle yet corrosive. A raised eyebrow, a dismissive tone, a curt reply could carry weight far heavier than any physical act. Jake's position was precarious, loved, but often overshadowed, seen, but not fully understood. In family gatherings, he was polite, attentive, sometimes withdrawn. He observed more than he spoke, cataloging patterns, habits, and moods. Friends later described him as the quiet observer, someone who always noticed when something was off long before anyone else did. The Reiners' social sphere only amplified pressure. High-profile friends, Hollywood executives, and critics all contributed to a sense that every interaction mattered, that missteps could ripple outward. Family events were performances in themselves: dinners, galas, vacations. All documented, analyzed, and remembered. Behind the cameras, emotions ran hot, and tempers flared with regularity. Jake's own emotional development became entwined with these dynamics. He learned to manage anger, disappointment, and fear internally, often bottling them up until they emerged unpredictably. This coping mechanism, while effective in public, created invisible pressure points that would later play a role in the events leading up to tragedy. By adulthood, Jake had cultivated a persona. Calm, thoughtful, loyal, but distant. He had friends who never truly understood the intensity of his family life. He had mentors who saw potential but couldn't grasp the constant tension surrounding him. And he had a younger life marked by both privilege and isolation. a paradox that shaped his decisions in ways even he wouldn't fully comprehend until everything unraveled. The siblings' relationship was complex. Affection mixed with rivalry, admiration intertwined with jealousy. Minor conflicts that might have been laughable in another family carried outsized weight here. Arguments over inheritance, recognition, and parental approval simmered quietly, yet relentlessly. One pivotal moment often cited by close acquaintances happened years before the incident. A confrontation over a personal project that Jake had poured himself into. Nick dismissed it publicly, Michelle criticized it privately, and Jake was left to reconcile both disappointment and humiliation. That experience, seemingly minor at the time, was a rehearsal for the emotional battles to come. As the Reiners' public stature grew, so did the scrutiny on their private lives. Paparazzi learned to anticipate events, journalists probed for tension, and social media amplified every rumor. Jake, unlike his family, did not seek attention, but he could not escape it. Every private frustration risked becoming public fodder, every minor slip magnified into scandal. And yet, despite these pressures, the family maintained its facade. To the outside world, they were successful, happy, and united. Private discord was skillfully hidden, carefully curated behind polite smiles and rehearsed laughter. But this duality, success versus dysfunction, created an environment where emotions could fester unseen, tensions could spiral unnoticed, and conflicts could explode with devastating consequences. In hindsight, friends and colleagues would say there were warning signs. Subtle disagreements, shifts in behavior, late-night arguments, uneasy silences. But within the family, those moments were normalized, dismissed as part of Reiner dynamics. No one predicted that such patterns could lead to catastrophic consequences. And yet, every family has tipping points. Small decisions, small moments, accumulate, shaping the trajectory of lives. For the Reiners, the tipping point arrived suddenly, violently, and unexpectedly. A Sunday that began like any other would end with lives shattered, legacies tarnished, and a son facing a legal and moral reckoning beyond imagination. Jake's journey to that fateful day was not one of overt malevolence. It was a collision of personality, circumstance, and history, a story of human complexity, where loyalty, fear, and familial obligation intersected dangerously. Understanding his place in the family is essential to understanding what happened next. Because the tragedy that unfolded was not an isolated act. It was the culmination of decades of human behavior, family dynamics, and private tensions that few outside the household could perceive. And as we delve deeper into the timeline of that day, it becomes painfully clear every choice, every hesitation, every silent observation played a role in the outcome. The next chapter begins in the hours leading up to the incident. A period of subtle shifts, miscommunications, and unnoticed signals that would cascade into irreversible consequences. But what happened during those hours, no one could have predicted, and no one was prepared for the truth. The morning began like any other in the sprawling Brentwood estate, a mansion that had seen decades of celebrations, quiet victories, and whispered disputes. Sunlight spilled over manicured lawns, glinting off the wrought iron gates that kept the outside world at bay. Birds chirped in the trees, neighbors jogged along the streets, and the scent of freshly cut grass filled the air. Yet behind the polished facade, tension simmered, invisible to anyone beyond the gates. Jake woke early that Sunday, as he often did. There was a rhythm to his mornings, a quiet meditation, a cup of coffee, a walk through the gardens. It was a ritual that allowed him to gather his thoughts, a practice of control in a world that often demanded chaos. But on that morning, even the familiar routines felt off. Small details that might have gone unnoticed before, an unusual silence from the main house, a door left slightly ajar, the faint hum of a security system, hinted at something unspoken, something brewing beneath the surface. Nick, meanwhile, was restless. His energy was frenetic, oscillating between bursts of activity and moments of brooding stillness. He had spent the previous evening pacing the guest house, arguing in low tones with someone on the phone. Neighbors later recalled seeing his car parked haphazardly, engine running, as if ready to leave at a moment's notice. Within the house, the tension between the brothers was palpable, though no one could yet define its shape or scope. Michelle, their mother, moved through her morning rituals with practiced calm. She prepared breakfast, checked schedules, and made calls with precision. Yet there were cracks. A clipped tone here, a sigh there, a subtle glance toward the guest house. Those who knew her well understood that such minor signs often reflected deeper worry, concern she could not express openly. Rob, the patriarch, maintained his usual composure. In public, he was unflappable, a figure of stability and authority. In private, however, even he could not mask the undercurrents that had begun to swirl in his household. Small disagreements over finances, estate planning, and family responsibilities had recently intensified, and the morning of the tragedy carried echoes of these tensions. Breakfast was prepared, but no one sat down together. Nick and Jake were both occupied with their own routines. Conversations were terse. Silence dominated the main house. In hindsight, the absence of ordinary familial chatter was a critical signal, a warning unheeded, a precursor to catastrophe. By evening, the estate had transformed from a private sanctuary to a site of intense scrutiny. Investigators worked tirelessly, media outlets speculated endlessly, and the public's curiosity collided with the gravity of reality. The implications for Jake were immediate. As someone present during the unfolding tragedy, his decisions and inactions were now inseparable from the events themselves. And yet, even amidst the shock and chaos, deeper questions lingered. How did family dynamics, history, and past grievances converge to create this moment? What unseen factors had contributed to the escalation? And most critically, what would happen next, to Jake, to the surviving family members, and to the legacy of a family once celebrated for creativity and influence? The stage was set for a legal and emotional reckoning. The aftermath of discovery was only the beginning, the moment when private tragedy intersected with public scrutiny, forcing questions about morality, loyalty, and justice that would be debated for years to come. But what came next, the arrest, the charges, and the courtroom drama, would turn the world's attention to Jake in ways no one could have anticipated. The evening air outside the Brentwood estate was calm, almost deceptively so, as law enforcement moved to secure the scene. The public remained largely unaware of the storm unfolding behind the gates. Inside, however, the dynamics were anything but calm. Authorities had arrived, protocols were initiated, and the process of separating fact from speculation had begun. At the center of it all was Jake, whose presence during the tragedy made him a focal point for questions, concern, and, ultimately, legal action. Jake's initial interactions with law enforcement were tense but measured. He answered questions cautiously, aware that every word, gesture, and pause could carry implications. Investigators approached with a mix of procedural rigor and the recognition that emotions in the household were raw, volatile, and unpredictable. Nick, already in custody, had been charged with the primary acts of violence. But Jake's role was murkier. He had been present during the events, and initial reports suggested a level of awareness or inaction that required scrutiny. Law enforcement faced the delicate task of determining complicity. To what extent did presence equal participation? How had he responded in the crucial moments? Could his actions, or lack thereof, be legally significant? By late evening, the decision was made to arrest Jake. The term accomplice was applied, not for acts of direct violence, but for his proximity, awareness, and potential inaction at critical junctures. Arrest procedures were conducted with professional precision, though the emotional undertones were palpable. Jake, once the quiet observer of family dynamics, was now cast into a very public narrative of legal consequence. The arrest was not instantaneous drama. There were no handcuffs slamming on wrists in a cinematic fashion. It was procedural, measured, a sober acknowledgement that the law needed to engage with the complex reality inside the estate. Jake's demeanor remained calm, though internal turmoil was evident, an amalgamation of grief, guilt, and shock. He understood the gravity of the situation and the long road that now lay ahead. News outlets broke the story almost immediately. The combination of celebrity, tragedy, and legal intrigue made the narrative irresistible. Headlines described the arrest with varying degrees of accuracy, some emphasizing the gravity, others sensationalizing the moral questions surrounding Jake's presence. Social media erupted with speculation, outrage, and debate. People questioned, could someone truly be responsible for failing to act? And if so, what consequences were just? Legal experts quickly weighed in. They discussed the nuances of being present during a crime without committing the act directly. Complicity, aiding and abetting, failure to intervene. These terms filled news cycles as attorneys and commentators dissected the situation. Jake, the quiet sibling, was now the subject of national discourse on morality, law, and familial loyalty. In the days following the arrest, Jake's movements and communications were tightly controlled. Attorneys arranged interviews, advised on statements, and began preparing for what would be an intense and highly scrutinized legal process. Investigators continued collecting evidence, reviewing surveillance, and interviewing staff and family members. Each piece of information further complicated the narrative, highlighting the intricate interplay of human behavior, family history, and legal responsibility. Public sentiment was mixed. Some viewed Jake as a tragic figure, caught in circumstances beyond his control, unable to prevent events that were set in motion by others. Others saw him as morally, if not legally, culpable. The debate underscored a broader question. What responsibilities do individuals have when they witness potential harm, particularly within a family or intimate circle? Meanwhile, inside the Reiner household, the emotional fallout continued. Staff and family members struggled with grief, confusion, and the stark reality of what had occurred. The intersection of legal action and personal loss created a surreal, almost disorienting environment. Every conversation, every movement, every decision was now filtered through the lens of tragedy and accountability. Jake's arrest marked a pivotal point in the narrative. It was not the end, nor even the culmination, but a turning point, a moment when private tragedy collided fully with public scrutiny and legal consequence. From this moment onward, the trajectory of his life, the family's legacy, and public perception would be inexorably altered. Yet, even with the arrest complete, the story was far from over. The coming weeks would reveal evidence, testimonies, and legal strategies that would complicate public perception further. Secrets long buried, contradictions in accounts, and hidden emotional currents would surface, making Jake's journey not just a legal battle, but a psychological and moral labyrinth. And as the legal machinery began grinding forward, one question loomed larger than any other. How would the world judge a man who did not commit the violence directly, but whose presence, choices, and silence were now inseparable from the tragedy itself? The moment Jake's arrest became public, the world outside the Brentwood estate shifted. Headlines splashed across screens, phones buzzed with alerts, and social media exploded with speculation. The story wasn't just about a family tragedy. It was about celebrity, legacy, morality, and the complexities of human behavior under extreme pressure. Every news outlet, from traditional networks to online tabloids, framed the narrative in ways that would shape public opinion for weeks, months, and perhaps years. From the outside, Jake's situation was simple to interpret. A son present during a horrific family event had been arrested as an accomplice. But in reality, it was far more complicated. Emotions, loyalties, history, and nuance were now being reduced to soundbites and 280-character summaries. Public perception, fueled by images of the estate, interviews with neighbors, and reconstructed timelines, began to paint Jake alternately as a tragic figure, a passive witness, or morally culpable. Journalists dug into the family history, highlighting long-standing dynamics that may have contributed to the tragedy. Stories emerged of sibling rivalries, past arguments, and patterns of tension that, taken together, formed a narrative of inevitable collision. Tabloids emphasized drama, clipped quotes, speculative motives, and interviews with distant acquaintances to create a story that was as much about entertainment as it was about fact. Social media, however, was where the narrative became most volatile. Opinions ranged from sympathy for Jake to outright condemnation. People debated moral responsibility. Should someone intervene if a loved one is in danger, even at personal risk? What about complicity? What does it mean to be present yet powerless? Hashtag threads exploded, memes circulated, and every public figure with a platform offered commentary, sometimes insightful, often sensationalized. The pressure of public scrutiny had an immediate effect on the Reiner family. Privacy, once fiercely guarded, became impossible. Calls, messages, and even casual mentions of their name were scrutinized. Every action, every statement, every emotional response was dissected, reinterpreted, and replayed. The family's grief collided with the unrelenting gaze of a global audience, amplifying pain and complicating the process of mourning. For Jake, the media frenzy was another layer of pressure atop the legal and emotional storm. He was no longer simply a private individual. He was a symbol, a case study, a cautionary tale. Each report, each headline, each tweet added weight to the psychological toll he was already experiencing. Public opinion, while not legally binding, influenced perception, strategy, and even courtroom atmosphere. Lawyers cautioned him on every public interaction. Statements were carefully scripted, measured, and designed to minimize additional exposure. Meanwhile, experts analyzed behavior, motives, and psychological dynamics in real time. Crime analysts offered breakdowns of decision-making under duress, psychologists discussed family dynamics and moral responsibility, and legal commentators debated the implications of being an accomplice versus being a witness. Each analysis added nuance to the public's understanding, but also intensified the pressure on Jake, who now had to navigate not only the legal system, but also the court of public opinion. Even friends and acquaintances were swept into the storm. Past relationships were examined, minor anecdotes were reinterpreted as potential evidence, and casual interactions were scrutinized. Everyone who had ever been connected to the family suddenly found themselves in a zone of uncertainty. Their credibility questioned, their loyalties doubted. The media coverage also magnified the emotional stakes for the public. People felt invested, outraged, or shocked. Not because they knew the family personally, but because the story tapped into universal questions: loyalty, morality, family responsibility, and human fallibility. Jake's presence in the narrative served as a focal point for broader societal debates about what is expected of individuals when faced with extreme circumstances involving those they love. Yet even amidst this frenzy, critical details remained obscured. Nuances of timing, the internal thought processes of those involved, and private emotional responses were impossible to convey fully in headlines or tweets. Public perception, while powerful, was inherently incomplete, a distorted reflection of a reality far more complex than any story could capture. And just as public perception intensified, the legal process began to take center stage. Investigators, prosecutors, and defense attorneys now moved to frame the narrative in court. Carefully selecting evidence, reconstructing timelines, and preparing arguments. The courtroom would become the next battleground, where the interplay of fact, interpretation, and human emotion would collide with the public's ever-growing appetite for judgment. The media frenzy set the stage for everything that followed. It amplified the stakes, shaped the narrative, and forced Jake to confront not only his legal challenges, but also the relentless scrutiny of a world eager for clarity, drama, and answers. But what happened in the courtroom, the strategies, revelations, and shocking testimonies, would change the perception of Jake's role in ways no one anticipated. The courtroom was tense, filled with a mixture of legal professionals, journalists, and observers who had been following every detail of the Reiner tragedy. Cameras were barred from the proceedings, but the presence of the media outside created a pressure cooker environment, where every word spoken inside would inevitably reach the public in some form. For Jake, entering this room was like stepping into a crucible, where the personal, the legal, and the public collided in a way that would define the rest of his life. From the outset, the prosecution framed the narrative with precision. Their argument was straightforward yet powerful. Jake had been present during the unfolding tragedy and had acted, or failed to act, in ways that constituted complicity. They painted a picture of observation without intervention, of hesitation at critical moments, and of moral responsibility that was legally enforceable. Every piece of evidence, every testimony, every timeline reinforced the idea that being present was not the same as being innocent. The defense, by contrast, emphasized nuance, emotion, and context. Jake was not the perpetrator of violence. He was a witness caught in circumstances beyond his control. His actions, or lack thereof, were influenced by fear, familial dynamics, and the sudden, chaotic nature of the event. Attorneys highlighted his character, his history of responsibility, and his role as a bystander forced to navigate an impossible situation. They argued that moral judgment and legal culpability were not always aligned, and that context was critical in understanding human behavior under extreme stress. Witness testimonies became a focal point of tension. Staff members described the escalating arguments, the atmosphere in the house, and Jake's positioning during critical moments. Each account was scrutinized, cross-examined, and reinterpreted by both sides. The narrative of presence versus participation became a recurring theme, illustrating the complexity of assigning blame when emotions, loyalty, and fear intersect. For Jake, sitting through testimonies was agonizing. Every detail recounted was a reminder of the morning's chaos, of decisions made in real time, of actions not taken, and of consequences that could not be reversed. The courtroom was not just a legal arena. It was an emotional battlefield where every word had weight, and where the past was reconstructed in meticulous detail for judgment. Psychologists and behavior experts were called to the stand. They provided insight into human responses under extreme stress, the psychology of family conflict, and the ways individuals can be paralyzed in moments of crisis. Their testimony added layers of complexity, challenging simple narratives of guilt and innocence. The prosecution's portrayal of an action was counterbalanced by scientific analysis of fear, shock, and moral hesitation. Evidence presented was exhaustive. Phone records, surveillance footage, forensic analysis of the scene, and timelines reconstructed from multiple perspectives. Each element served to illustrate the sequence of events, clarify Jake's location during critical moments, and examine his possible decisions. The court became a stage where fact, perception, and interpretation collided, leaving no easy answers. Outside the courtroom, media coverage intensified. Headlines reported dramatic exchanges, emotional reactions, and the growing tension between prosecution and defense. Public interest remained high, and social media speculation continued to shape opinion, even as the legal process moved deliberately forward. For Jake, this dual pressure, legal scrutiny and public judgment, was relentless. The first week of testimony revealed contradictions, uncertainties, and emotional volatility. Witnesses sometimes contradicted themselves or one another, and small details were amplified in significance. Lawyers on both sides leveraged these inconsistencies to advance their narratives, turning the courtroom into a chessboard of strategy, perception, and interpretation. As the trial progressed, Jake's personal narrative began to emerge more fully. Letters, private communications, and past behaviors were introduced to provide context for his actions or inactions. The public began to understand that the case was not about violence alone, but about the complex interplay of family dynamics, moral responsibility, and human psychology. By the end of the first phase of the trial, one fact was undeniable: the courtroom drama was only beginning. Every testimony, every piece of evidence, and every emotional revelation would continue to shape public perception and legal outcomes. Jake's presence in the room, once passive, was now central, his future intertwined with every unfolding moment. And just as tension reached a peak in the courtroom, a surprising piece of evidence surfaced, one that no one outside or inside the estate had anticipated. Its revelation would send shockwaves through the trial, shifting momentum and complicating the narrative in ways that left everyone questioning what they thought they knew. The courtroom was silent, the kind of heavy silence that presses down on every observer and leaves a palpable tension in the air. All eyes were on the prosecution's table when a new piece of evidence was introduced, something that no one, not the family, the public, or even Jake, had fully anticipated. It was a series of communications, texts, emails, and digital notes that revealed not only the undercurrents of tension between family members, but also hints of prior knowledge and unspoken conflicts that had been simmering for months. The room buzzed as the documents were presented. Words once private were now exposed for all to see, and they painted a more complex, nuanced picture than the initial narrative suggested. Arguments over finances, subtle threats masked as jokes, and disputes over household responsibilities, all mundane on the surface, now gained a weight that altered the interpretation of that fateful day. Jake's legal team moved quickly, seizing the opportunity to contextualize the evidence. They argued that while tensions existed, none of these communications indicated intent or premeditation on Jake's part. His role remained that of a witness, navigating a volatile environment rather than orchestrating it. Yet the prosecution seized on selective phrases, suggesting that awareness of conflict equated to responsibility, and that silence in the face of impending danger was a form of complicity. Witnesses were called to interpret the communications. Staff members, neighbors, and friends all testified to the family's dynamics, each providing insight into the relationships, history, and daily interactions that had often gone unnoticed. Their accounts revealed subtle patterns. Repeated disputes between the siblings, signs of stress in the parents, and moments where intervention could have changed the trajectory of the morning. As testimony unfolded, inconsistencies emerged. Some witnesses recalled interactions differently, while others highlighted behaviors that contradicted prior statements. This created a tense courtroom atmosphere where every word was weighed for meaning, every hesitation analyzed for significance. Jake sat quietly, absorbing each revelation, understanding that these revelations could redefine public perception and influence the jury's judgment. Psychological experts returned to the stand, examining the communications and behaviors in the context of family dynamics, stress response, and moral decision-making. Their analyses underscored the human complexity behind the tragedy. Fear, loyalty, shock, and hesitation were all natural responses to extraordinary circumstances. They emphasized that understanding intent requires careful consideration of context, not just surface appearances. Outside the courtroom, the media pounced. Headlines splashed phrases like "family secrets exposed" and "new evidence shocks court" across digital platforms. Detectives were now grappling with motive in a way they hadn't before. This was not a random attack, and it was not impulsive. Every element of the crime pointed to deliberation, planning, and personal grievance. And the note suggested a calculated message, a declaration, almost, of intent or justification. Meanwhile, Romy's recollections provided more subtle yet significant insights. As investigators gently questioned her about her parents' recent interactions, she revealed tensions that had previously gone unreported. Disagreements over financial matters, subtle threats from business associates, and unexplained absences painted a more complex picture of the Reiners' private lives. It became increasingly clear that the family had been navigating a web of conflicts and secrets, some hidden even from their closest friends. The detectives began reconstructing the night of the murders using every available tool: digital timelines, physical evidence, witness statements, and forensic reconstruction. They simulated movements, tested alibis, and charted every potential scenario. The results revealed one thing with terrifying clarity: the perpetrator had moved through the house with knowledge, confidence, and control. This was not an intruder stumbling into opportunity. It was a calculated attack by someone who knew the Reiners intimately. And yet, there were still contradictions. Some timelines didn't align perfectly, some evidence seemed intentionally misleading, and some witness accounts conflicted in subtle ways. The killer had been clever, leaving just enough gaps and red herrings to confuse the investigation. But for the first time, detectives sensed a pattern emerging, an underlying logic to the chaos. By the end of the day, the team convened to review the breakthrough. The hidden witness had provided critical confirmation, the note suggested a motive, and the forensic evidence hinted at the killer's identity, or at least their methods. Yet, as promising as these discoveries were, a shadow of doubt remained. Someone was still eluding capture, someone who had planned with precision, someone who might be watching the investigation as closely as the detectives were watching the evidence. And then came the chilling realization: the next piece of evidence, buried in plain sight, would not only shock the detectives, but could rewrite everything they thought they knew about the case. What they were about to discover would expose a secret that no one could have anticipated, and it would change the direction of the investigation in ways that were both terrifying and extraordinary. The investigation had reached a pivotal stage. By the sixth day, the detectives were operating under the understanding that this was no ordinary crime. Every clue, every fiber, every contradiction pointed toward an assailant who had meticulously planned the murders and who had intimate knowledge of the Reiners' lives. But the real breakthrough came when a seemingly unrelated lead unexpectedly connected threads that had, until now, appeared disjointed. The detectives were reviewing phone records late at night when an anomaly appeared. There were repeated calls between one of Rob's business associates and a number that had not been previously flagged. What made it significant wasn't just the frequency of the calls, it was the timing. The last call had occurred just hours before the murders, and the call duration matched the window when the Reiners were believed to have been attacked. The connection was subtle, but it was enough to warrant immediate attention. Detective Elridge assigned a team to trace the number. The investigation revealed it was registered to a temporary cell phone purchased in Los Angeles, an untraceable device, frequently used to obscure identity. Yet, the patterns in calls and movements pointed toward a familiar presence. Whoever was behind this had deliberately tried to cover their tracks, but had overlooked minor details. A location ping here, a signal anomaly there. In a case this intricate, even the smallest slip could reveal everything. While this digital trail was unfolding, forensic analysts reported a breakthrough in the laboratory. DNA found on the torn fabric from the hallway had been partially degraded, but advances in forensic testing allowed them to isolate a partial profile. Cross-referencing it with known associates of the Reiners and recent visitors to their estate produced a short list of individuals who matched the profile. It was still circumstantial, but the leads were converging in a way that the detectives hadn't anticipated. Simultaneously, detectives re-examined the safe hidden in the Reiners' private office. One of the letters inside, previously overlooked, contained a cryptic warning. Your choices will be remembered. It was unsigned, and no one could place it to a specific person. But when combined with the phone records and the DNA evidence, the investigators began to see a pattern. There was someone who had not only access but motive, knowledge, and the psychological mindset necessary to execute this horrifying crime. As the pieces came together, the detectives also discovered a contradiction in witness statements that had previously seemed trivial. A neighbor, interviewed multiple times, had claimed that no visitors had been seen that evening, but cross-referencing with the hidden witness account revealed otherwise. A second, shorter figure had been seen briefly in the driveway, appearing to monitor the property. The detectives realized that this second individual could have been a lookout, an accomplice, or someone indirectly involved, a key factor that had been completely missed until now. Romy's account, too, gained new significance. Small details she mentioned in passing, like the faint scent of a particular cologne or the position of a lamp that had been shifted, suddenly aligned with forensic evidence. These seemingly trivial observations now painted a picture of someone with intimate familiarity with the home's layout and routines, moving deliberately to avoid detection while carrying out the crime. The breakthrough, however, came in the late afternoon when a team member discovered an overlooked security camera near the rear gate. The footage had been partially obscured by tree branches, but a careful frame-by-frame analysis revealed a figure entering the property. The person's movements were cautious, deliberate, almost choreographed. Most chillingly, the figure paused near the flower pot where the master bedroom key had been hidden, confirming the hidden witness's account. Detective Elridge reviewed the footage alone, the room silent except for the hum of computers. "This is it," he muttered. "This is someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The movement, the timing, the precise knowledge of entry points, it all pointed to a single conclusion. The killer was not random. The person had planned this attack, and they had done so with foresight, patience, and ruthless precision. But as the detectives began connecting the dots, they realized something that shook them to their core. The person indicated by the evidence wasn't just familiar with the Reiners' routines, they were familiar with the family itself. Someone close enough to observe, to learn, and to anticipate behavior. The investigation was no longer just about solving a crime. It was about uncovering betrayal, secrets, and relationships hidden in plain sight. By the end of the day, the investigation had reached a critical juncture. The phone records, the DNA evidence, the hidden witness, and the security footage all converged toward a shocking connection. A connection that challenged everything the detectives had believed about the Reiners' lives and deaths. Every clue now suggested that the killer was not an outsider, but someone intertwined with the family's inner circle. Yet, despite this breakthrough, questions remained. How many people were involved? Were there accomplices? And what had driven someone so close to commit such a calculated and brutal act? The detectives knew they were on the brink of uncovering answers, but the final piece, the piece that would tie everything together, was still out there, hidden in the shadows. And when it surfaced, it would reveal a truth so shocking that it would change the investigation forever, forcing everyone involved to confront a reality they could never have imagined. By the seventh day, the investigation into the Reiner murders had evolved into a high-stakes, psychological puzzle. Every lead, every piece of evidence, every witness statement was scrutinized multiple times, yet the case remained maddeningly complex. Detectives now understood that the killer, or killers, were methodical, precise, and intimately familiar with the family. But the question remained, who and why? To answer this, behavioral analysts were brought in to construct a profile. They studied the crime scene meticulously, analyzing everything from the positioning of the bodies to the choice of entry points, the timing of the attacks, and the nature of the wounds. This is not impulsive, one analyst told the team. This is someone who planned this attack down to the smallest detail. They understand human behavior, timing, and control. They may be charming, normal in appearance, but beneath that, calculating and ruthless. The profile suggested several key characteristics. Someone close to the victims, likely known to them, someone organized, patient, and able to manipulate situations, and someone capable of managing stress under extreme pressure. The analyst also emphasized the psychological impact of the crime scene. The way certain items had been deliberately left untouched, the precise nature of the attacks, and the cryptic messages found in the Reiners' private files. It suggested a killer who wanted to convey a message, someone obsessed with control, symbolism, or revenge. Meanwhile, detectives followed a dangerous new lead. One of the individuals flagged in the DNA and phone records was traced to a location on the outskirts of Los Angeles, an abandoned warehouse known to be a hub for illicit activity. Surveillance teams were deployed, cautiously observing the area, aware that this suspect might be armed, desperate, and unpredictable. The tension was palpable. Any wrong move could compromise the investigation or put lives in danger. Inside the warehouse, investigators discovered items that suggested premeditation: gloves matching the fibers found at the Reiner mansion, discarded clothing, and personal items linked to the suspect. There were traces of planning, notes, and maps that outlined specific locations, times, and movements. It was chilling to see the evidence laid out so methodically. It confirmed what the analysts had theorized. The killer had rehearsed the crime mentally, perhaps even physically, before committing it. Back at headquarters, the detectives continued reviewing witness statements and cross-referencing timelines. The hidden witness's account was re-examined in light of the new findings and small details she had mentioned, like the scent of cologne, the precise timing of movements, and the posture of the figure near the driveway, now aligned with the forensic and digital evidence. Each piece reinforced the notion of a perpetrator both meticulous and intimately familiar with the Reiners' routines. But the investigation was far from straightforward. Conflicting accounts still created confusion, and the suspect's careful planning meant that there were still gaps in the timeline. Security footage from neighboring properties was incomplete, some devices had been tampered with, and certain witnesses remembered events differently under the pressure of police questioning. The detectives understood that the killer had anticipated much of this, leaving red herrings designed to mislead and delay discovery. A critical breakthrough came when an associate of the suspect inadvertently left a digital trail. A message, sent in error, referenced a location near the Reiner estate in the days leading up to the murders. Investigators quickly cross-referenced this with other communications and found a pattern, a network of movements, messages, and minor transactions that suggested coordination, possibly with accomplices. The case was no longer a single-person operation. It was increasingly likely that multiple people were involved, each playing a role in a carefully orchestrated plan. Detectives also began re-examining the note found in the Reiner's office. Your choices will be remembered. Combined with the suspect's network, the note suggested motive rooted in perceived betrayal, revenge, or unresolved conflict. It was psychological proof of intent, a signature left behind not just to confuse investigators, but to assert dominance, to communicate that the killer had calculated every step and expected the repercussions to follow. As the day progressed, investigators felt the weight of urgency. Every new lead could be the key to identifying and apprehending the perpetrator. Yet each lead carried risk. Confront the suspect too early, and evidence could be destroyed. Wait too long, and they might strike again or disappear entirely. Timing became critical, a high-stakes game of strategy and caution. By evening, a small but pivotal error by the suspect provided the detectives with an unexpected opportunity. Surveillance footage captured a brief but unmistakable glimpse of the individual outside the warehouse, interacting with an object linked to the Reiner estate. The suspect's confidence had betrayed them. The tiniest lapse, just a few seconds, was enough to create a tangible connection between them and the crime scene. Detective Elridge studied the footage, his jaw tight. They made a mistake, he said. Just one. That's all we need. One mistake, and the pattern becomes clear. We can't let this slip. The team immediately began coordinating, planning the next steps, and preparing to move on the suspect. But they also knew the danger. This was someone capable, intelligent, and desperate. Any confrontation could escalate quickly. The tension reached its peak as the investigators realized the significance of the breakthrough. A hidden network, a meticulous profile, a minor but critical mistake, everything was converging. And yet, the killer remained at large, their movements unpredictable, their motives still partially obscured. What they were about to uncover next, a piece of evidence no one had considered, a link hidden in plain sight, would push the investigation into uncharted territory and expose a truth so unsettling that it would leave detectives questioning everything they thought they knew about the Reiners' lives, the murders, and the people around them. The 8th day of the Reiner investigation began with a sense of cautious anticipation. Every lead had been examined, every witness interviewed multiple times, yet the case remained an intricate maze of contradictions, hidden motives, and meticulously planned actions. Detectives knew that the smallest overlooked detail could be the breakthrough that finally unraveled the mystery. That detail emerged unexpectedly. A colleague of Rob's came forward, claiming to have information he had previously withheld out of fear of involvement or reprisal. At first, investigators were skeptical, wary of misinformation or exaggeration. But as he described conversations, observations, and subtle behavioral shifts he had noticed over the past month, the pieces began to fit in an unsettling way. He recounted an incident from 2 weeks prior, when Rob had seemed unusually anxious. He kept checking the locks, moving the keys, making sure the doors were secure, the colleague said. He didn't say why, just that he felt someone was watching. I thought he was stressed about business, but now... His voice trailed off, the implication hanging in the air. Investigators immediately cross-referenced these claims with the hidden witness account and the security footage timeline. The alignment was too precise to dismiss. Rob had been aware, even partially, of a looming threat. Meanwhile, forensic analysts reviewed the photographs and physical evidence one more time, looking for anything missed in previous sweeps. That's when they noticed a faint smudge on the interior of the master bedroom window. Almost imperceptible, but suggestive of someone having reached through, possibly to unlock it from the inside or attempt entry. Paired with the torn fabric, the chemical traces, and the gloves, this minor detail suddenly carried enormous weight. It indicated access, premeditation, and a level of sophistication in maneuvering through the house. Then came the confession. A startling, partial admission from an individual previously considered a peripheral witness. Under pressure during questioning, this person revealed knowledge of actions that had taken place inside the mansion, including movements, objects touched, and communications that had previously gone unreported. The confession was carefully worded, limited in scope, but its implications were profound. It suggested direct observation or involvement and pointed toward a motive connected to personal grievances and perceived betrayals within the family and their close associates. Detectives began cross-referencing the confession with forensic evidence. Each detail matched previously overlooked or underappreciated data points. The angle of the blood spatter, the positioning of objects in the bedroom, even the sequence of sounds reported by neighbors. The confession, limited though it was, validated multiple leads simultaneously, giving the investigators their first cohesive narrative of how the attack had unfolded. The emotional dimension of the investigation became unavoidable at this point. Romy's recollections, combined with interviews of family friends, revealed layers of tension, fear, and hidden conflict that had been invisible to the public. It became clear that the family had been navigating a web of secrets. Financial, personal, and relational, that created vulnerability. The confession shed light on the perpetrator's possible awareness of these vulnerabilities, explaining how they could execute such a precise and devastating act. Yet, even with the confession, the investigation was far from complete. Detectives knew they had only scratched the surface of the perpetrator's intentions. The admission pointed to planning, knowledge, and motive, but it didn't fully explain the brutality of the crime, the choice of targets, or the timing. The confession raised as many questions as it answered. Who else might have been involved? What had driven the suspect to such calculated violence? And what evidence had been left deliberately to mislead investigators? The overlooked evidence, the faint smudge on the window, the trace fibers, the chemical residues, suggested a killer who had rehearsed, anticipated, and adapted. Every action appeared premeditated, yet small errors, like leaving fingerprints or leaving fibers behind, revealed the human element. The detectives realized they were dealing with someone who was meticulous, but not infallible. The challenge was to connect these minor imperfections into a coherent profile that would allow them to identify and apprehend the perpetrator before further harm could occur. As the day progressed, investigators synthesized the confession, the forensic data, the hidden witness account, and Romy's recollections. The narrative was becoming clearer, a calculated, personal attack executed by someone with intimate knowledge of the Reiners' routines, resources, and vulnerabilities.